It's kind of unnerving. I gavel us in. Thank you all. It's great to see everyone. I appreciate you showing up on a Monday in the early afternoon, but I wanted to take a moment, and I had sent a note out to the commissioners in terms of the loss that the department has seen. And I just, again, wanted to express our sincere condolences to Joey's family and to the agency and all the folks that have worked with him as long as they have. He was a amazing public servant, and he certainly will be lost. So I just, we're sorry for your loss. So we have two topics on the agenda, both in terms of EVs and hybrids, and the tolling issues are the two on the menu for today. I'm trying to hold this as close to 2 hours as possible. So we're going to try and keep things moving along. At the same time, I am looking for the commissioner's engagement as we get to the next stage in our conversations relative to any types of recommendations that we will be making in December. So with that, I think we'll start with the overviews. I will ask that folks hold questions until the end so that we can have the agencies make their presentations, and then we can take questions at the end of that. And with that, we will start off with Darian. Daron, you're up.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, commissioners. Delighted to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you this afternoon. I'm Darren Lovas, and I'm Chief of Environment and Sustainable Transportation, which is a new program at MDOT. And I'm joined by Colleen Turner, Associate Vice President and Senior Project Manager with Michael Baker International. Colleen is the lead analyst on the study whose findings we're going to present to you this afternoon. And it's the electric vehicle fee study. And without further ado, I will turn it over to her for the first few slides, and then I'll take over after that. Colleen?
Okay, great. Thanks, Darren. So MDOT's fee study was prepared and submitted in September of 2023 in response to this request that you're seeing here. That was contained in the Joint Chairman's report for the 2023 session on the fiscal 2024 state operating and capital budgets. And the JCR report requested that MDOT investigate three things: the fees that other states impose on zero and low emission vehicles, the revenue that's raised by each fee, and then finally, any studies that have been done on the impact that such fees have on ZEV and LEV vehicle purchases. So this presentation is going to quickly walk through those results of MDOT's fee study and then conclude with some considerations related to ZEV and LEV fees. So to provide some context for the fee study results, we've included a snapshot of zero emission vehicle registrations in Maryland. And I should say here that this graphic does actually include battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric projections. The figures were projected utilizing new car sales assumptions under the Advanced Clean Cars 2 program, which Maryland adopted this year and takes effect with the model year 2027. The reason that you're seeing 2031 as the end year here is because it directly corresponds to the goals of the Climate Solutions Now Act. And in 2031, the goal is to reduce emissions 60% from 2006 levels. So we're projecting about 1.3 million vehicles, or about 26% of the light duty LDV, light duty vehicle fleet, will be zero emission by 2031. Here's a quick snapshot and a high-level overview of the states that have adopted or proposed ZEV and or low emission vehicle fees. So a total of 33 states have actually enacted fees. 31 of these states have adopted annual fees. So the two exceptions are Oregon and South Carolina. They adopted biannual fees. 27 of the 33 have both ZEV and LEV. So here we mean again, battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric fees. 6 of the 33 states have ZEV only, so battery electric vehicle fees only. And there are 11 states here, including Maryland, that have proposed registration fees at some point, but haven't enacted them. There's only 6 states that have not enacted or proposed a fee. And DC is the only example here of a reduced fee or a credit that is given to ZEV owners of $36. This is a lot, but it offers the comparison of the 33 states that have enacted the ZEV and LEV fees, and it's organized from the lowest battery electric or ZEV fee to the highest ZEV fee. So the ZEV fees range from a low of $50 in states like Hawaii and South Dakota to over $200 in Georgia. There are 7 states that have a fee of $200 or greater. So that includes Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Ohio, Texas, West Virginia, and Wyoming. The average ZEV fee is about $28. And then on the LEV side, so these are the plug-in hybrids, remember, they range from about $0 to, again, over $200 in Georgia. The average plug-in hybrid or LEV fee is about $63. And most of the states that have opted to charge LEV fees charge lower fees than they do for ZEVs. There's several states here where you can see, maybe you can see, they charge $0. And here we have an illustration of when states have adopted fees. So about 51% of the states adopted fees in or after 2020, and about 80% of all the states that have adopted in or after 2017. So this is particularly interesting when it comes to collecting data and identifying the studies, which is one of the calls of the JCR report. And we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. So the earliest fee was adopted by Missouri in the year 2000, and that was updated subsequently in 2021. And Kentucky represents the most recent adoption, which becomes effective next year in 2024. So I'll turn it over to Darren.
Great. Thank you very much, Colleen. All right, this slide illustrates the gross revenue generated by states that have adopted fees. Now, to be clear, it doesn't include any assumptions or estimations related to mileage-based user fees, any costs associated with the administration of ZEV or LEV fees, or any offsets in revenue resulting from the distribution of vehicle-based incentives. States that have adopted ZEV-LEV fees do not have a uniform reporting process or methodology for summarizing and sharing the revenue generated by the fees in total since inception or on an annual basis. Now, to estimate the potential gross revenue each state might be generating, what we did is take the total population of ZEV and LEV and then multiplied that by the annual fee for the respective vehicle type and then summed it all up. The average gross revenue across states is about $4.4 million. California leads the pack with most revenue based primarily on a huge vehicle population and their fee of $108. Now, for context, Maryland generated more than $860 million in gross gasoline tax revenue in fiscal year 2021. Now, what's been the impact of fees on registrations? 6 states, we chose 6 states specifically based on geographic diversity and variance in ZEV fees, from the lowest end, represented here by Colorado at $50, a mid-range, Wisconsin at $100, and Oregon at $115, and a higher range represented by Alabama, Arkansas, and Georgia, all around $200. 5 of the 6 states continue to see growth in ZEV registrations following the adoption of ZEV fees. It's important to note that Colorado adopted their fee in 2013, and Georgia adopted their initial fee in 2015. Those dates are not included in the graphic because there's a lack of registration data before 2016. Georgia was the only state, as you can see, to experience a ZEV registration decrease from 2016 through 2017, although that's widely assumed to be the result of Georgia's decision to eliminate tax rebates for ZEVs, originally in 2015. While Georgia offers charging infrastructure tax credits and alternative fuel vehicle conversion tax credits, they never reinstated the vehicle tax credit. Despite this, EV registrations rebounded in Georgia and have continued to grow since 2017. All right. This issue has been studied, albeit not as recently as we would have preferred. And this slide and the next slide are included for information purposes and reference the studies that we reviewed in response to the JCR request. The studies are organized in reverse date order and were published between 2017 and 2020. As earlier in our presentation, there are only 6 states that have not proposed or enacted ZEV-RELEV fees. About 80% of the fees were enacted in 2017 or later. The timing of these studies is significant because data, methodologies, ZEV-RELEV markets, and federal policy have changed significantly over the past 3 years. Automakers have committed to the production and sale of ZEV and LEV, and the federal government has dedicated $7.5 billion to the bipartisan infrastructure law to help make infrastructure accessible for all Americans taking local and long distance trips. Since the studies were published, we've also benefited from gathering of additional data, which is increasingly better organized and made available through resources like the U.S. Department of Energy's Alternative Fuels Data Center. The studies come from various sources, including the National Governors Association and Consumer Reports. And to be clear, all the studies caution that EV fees could have a negative impact on EV adoption. Having said that, we have some considerations to offer to the Commission. These are topic areas to consider when exploring ZEV or LEV fees. First, we urge you to consider the potential of varying fees based on vehicle technology and weight. There are a couple of states that have varying fees by battery capacity, for example, Oklahoma and Oregon, for example. There are also states that have implemented indexed fees, planned increases to fees over time, and the potential of combining fees or offering users a choice. For example, Hawaii will begin offering users a choice between a flat fee or a mileage-based fee beginning in 2025. We also wanted to illustrate some of the potential overlap between ZEV fees and equity and emissions reduction goals. There are several companion policies and programs now being implemented, such as the work of the Commission on Environmental Justice and Sustainable Communities, the Justice 40 Initiative, the Climate Solutions Now Act, and the goals of the Clean Cars 2 regulation that could be impacted by fee and revenue decisions. This is why we recommend also conducting scenario analyses, to better understand the overall impacts to consumers as well as on these companion policies. And that's where we end. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions and answering them now as well as later. Thanks very much.
Thank you both very much. Do any other commissioners have questions for this panel? No. Oh. Commissioner Tolkien, you're on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. First, I was wondering if you could just start us off by going back to the discussion of California Clean Cars 2 program that we're signed on to. Could you discuss what the goals of that program and the timeline of it is?
Sure.
Oh, thanks. Whoever turned that on. Yeah, so the California, it's Advanced Clean Car 2 is the program that Maryland adopted. It is akin to the California program, and it's related to sales percentages, new car sales percentages. In California, it starts in 2025, but because of some of the notice that states are required to give automakers, Maryland can't really implement until 2027. So loosely, if you were just to look at the new car sales percentages in 2031, it's about 75% of new car sales, and it kind of decreases down to 2027 from there. With it, I should also mention that the goal is 100% new car sales by 2035. There are some other ways that automakers can meet those sales percentages. It doesn't just have to be sales. There's some waivers that they can get for equity and environmental justice and some other things that can help them satisfy those percentages. But there are some limitations in that. So I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, that's great. So, so the slide about projected ZEV registrations, that's total registrations or registrations projected for that based on sales of that year?
It is total registrations.
Okay. Do you have the figure for what, and this is sort of, I assume, a business as usual projection at this point?
As of right now, I think that's fair to say, based on the fact that ACC2 is now on the books. Yeah.
Okay. And do you have a projection for what the annual sales would be in 2031 that resulted in this total of 26%?
No, but what we did do is project, so the box that you see there is what we're projecting as the total light duty fleet. So that should also make that clear. Like light duty fleet means passenger cars and passenger trucks. And we think that the overall population is going to be around 5.9 around 5 million, let's say.
Okay, well, it's roughly 200, looks like around 230,000 registrations occur between 2030 and 2031. So around there, and you know how much the total registrations per year are?
I don't, I'm sorry.
So what I'm trying to figure out is that entering this conversation, it would be good to know what we're projecting Maryland's pathway to be, business as usual, in order to achieve this very ambitious goal that we've set. So we can take that into account when thinking about the potential impact of these fees. I guess the second part is there are penalties or disincentives for not achieving this goal, right?
Yes. Yes.
So I guess, and I don't recall if they're specific or if they're state determined or determined by the network, but I think as we're doing an economic analysis of how much we'd raise from some type of EV fees, knowing if we're also positioning Marylanders to pay some penalty for not achieving our ZEV and LEV goals would be really important, because we hate to, save money on one hand only to cost the state money on the other hand.
Yeah, so to be clear, the penalty for not meeting it doesn't fall on as the responsibility of Maryland. If it is the responsibility of the automakers to meet that, and there are penalties associated with not meeting it, and it is in conjunction. So it's in conjunction with the Maryland or with the California vehicle standards, right? So Maryland signed on to it, other states can sign on to it, and then they look at that as a whole, and they need to meet those goals. The OEMs and automakers they can be penalized.
Great.
So it wouldn't fall on Maryland consumers or ZEV owners to pay that penalty.
Okay.
And just add a few data points that you're asking about. So we've got about 5 million registered vehicles, 87,000 currently electric plug-in hybrid vehicles. So that's where we are today. So there's a baseline stats, and then I'll find what the annual sales are so that you know that, because I think that's what you're asking as well. But to Colleen's point, it is on the manufacturers. I think it is a point of consideration though, because dealers are concerned about what that percentage looks like relative to gas-powered vehicles. And so it does impact us, especially being a state with close proximity to other jurisdictions, and how that plays itself out as we get closer to those target years.
Right. Thank you. And the other reason I'm bringing it up is that right now, the Maryland Department of the Environment is considering, what the most economical pathway is for Maryland to achieve its climate goals, and being able to compare the cost of, let's say, incentives versus fees on electric vehicles versus reducing pollution in the electric sector is an overall cost consideration for the state. And I think that's the challenge. And I don't know the appropriate people that we need to have this conversation, but I think you mentioned the Commission on Climate Change right now is discussing potential rebates ranging from about $1,500 to $2,500, depending on one's economic status. So at the moment, we have one department or one body looking at braiding a state rebate on top of a federal tax credit in the interest of accelerating deployment. And I don't know if the answer is a smaller rebate opposed to a rebate plus a fee, but I'm just trying to figure out what the process is, how we're going to bring those two conversations together.
Right. So actually, our last slide was sort of shorthand to some of what you're talking about, which is various principles that we need to consider when deciding what policies to move forward with. And we have the ACT2 mandate, which complements the Climate Solutions Now Act economy-wide target effectively. We have the Inflation Reduction Act incentives, not just for used car sales, not new car sales, but also used car sales. We have potential additional incentives from the Maryland Department, from Maryland, that is. And then we have all this investment going on into charging infrastructure. We're moving to electrify the fleet as quickly as possible. And the question is how we also deal with this user fee issue in terms of being able to pay into the trust fund and to help with transportation revenue as well.
Thank you very much. I will just add that I do think the discussion about potential weight of vehicles is very important, especially because the heavier electric vehicles can actually have a disproportionate impact on wear and tear on the roads. And discussing potential income indicators would be really good as we're thinking about the equity of access to electric vehicles. So thank you very much for flagging those.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Slide 10, you have the different revenue yields for the different states. Do you know how the revenue is used by the different states? Do they just all put it into their equivalent of the Transportation Trust Fund? Do they use it for specific purposes? Do they use it to fund rebates for future EV purchases? Do you know what they use it for?
I can go ahead and start and Colleen can contribute. It varies, right? So, and there are some states with relatively large fees that they charge, and a portion of the revenue goes to help with charging infrastructure build out. So it would help EV owners basically. So some of it is dedicated to that. For the most part, I think it's dedicated to shoring up transportation trust funds because states obviously face this issue. Maryland is not the only state that faces the issue we're wrestling with right now.
Do you know if any use it to support transit?
That is an excellent question.
What about, and if you're offering to look into that further, which I'm reading into your comment,
Yeah.
what about conversion of transit to electrification?
That is also an excellent question. And we're happy to look into it.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner Laria.
Thanks. Mr. Chair, I have a series of questions, so you can cut me off whenever you want, but I'm going to try and make them brief. First of all, how much do we have a slide that says how much this would raise at pick a number, $200, which seems to be a sort of popular number?
You are sort of previewing the next presentation, Commissioner Laria, just to
All
let
right.
you know.
Well, then I'm happy to stand down on that question. These are like economist questions, I'm afraid, and I'm not an economist, but not seeing a reduction, is that the same thing as, is there a reduction in growth, even though there's an absolute increase? Do we know? I mean, the slides sort of say this fee is not reducing the purchase of EVs, et cetera. But do we know if there would be more if the fee were not in place?
That's a great question. Darren asked that question.
I
actually.
did ask that question actually, and
we didn't investigate that.
Okay.
So we were really just looking at the relationship between the institution of the EV fee and then subsequent registration. So it's hard to know if the fee didn't exist, what would have happened,
right.
right?
So this shows correlation, not causation, and it's hard to tell
Right.
what the counterfactual would be. It could have been a faster growth rate. You're right.
Yeah, I would think there would be some data, like someone would have done a study that said, would you have bought this if not in Maryland, then just somewhere in the marketplace? No? You would know.
No.
You would think that would
Yeah.
be the case.
Can you also go back a step, and maybe other folks are as curious as remind us what the current incentive structure is federally or in Maryland for EVs? Because there is this whole question about whether we're just moving money from one bucket to another, or whether we're finding new money, et cetera. So what is the current incentive structure? And if you can, do we have a sense of where the incentive structure might be going? Is there a point at which people think it's going to phase out, or frankly, people will put their foot on the proverbial accelerator and it'll get bigger? Do we know?
So federally, the Inflation Reduction Act extended tax credits for new EV sales, and I think it's $5,000 a vehicle currently, and I forget when the out year for that is.
Say it again.
$5,000.
Uh-huh.
And then there's a new used EV purchase incentive in the Inflation Reduction Act as well for the first time. And that also, unfortunately, I forget the out year for that as well. But most of what's in the Inflation Reduction Act is meant to span 10 years. So you could probably think of these as decade-long policies. In terms of what's in place in Maryland, I know the Maryland Climate Change Commission is looking at recommending various rebate levels. And honestly, I'm not sure what the Maryland rebate level is currently.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the Maryland rebate level is either.
It's 3,000,
but
up to 3,000.
Up to 3,000, thank you.
Yeah, and I will also say that there's other companion incentives, right, for installing infrastructure, say, publicly or privately in the workforce at your home.
Does anyone calibrate this for, say, commercial versus individual use? If you have a fleet, people get a discount or a premium or something so that it affects people differently?
That is a good question, and we
All
can
right.
To
research that.
calibrate incentives or to calibrate fees?
Fees, meaning, if someone said, well, look, $200 might not be, it's the same question about all these things when you have commercial motor carriers, et cetera. Say,
Mhm.
well, it may not mean much to you as a one person, but for us and our bottom line, it's bigger. So I'm just wondering if anybody takes that into account in their fee structure somewhere else.
We didn't observe that with the
Yeah.
light duty fleet, no.
And then finally, if you don't mind, this was presented to JCR. It was due on September 1st, right?
Yeah, it
I
was.
mean, it was
yep,
delivered.
It was delivered.
And is this it? This was the JCR presentation or was it a different presentation?
No, well,
It's actually a report, and these slides are based off of it, basically.
Could we see the report? I assume it's,
Yes, it should be on the website, and we're more
Okay.
than happy to send it around, so.
all right. Thank you very much. Thanks,
Okay,
Chair.
thank you. Commissioner Ali?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. Just a real quick question. The LEV number, that includes hybrids that aren't plugged in as well?
no, that includes plug-in hybrid only.
So where do hybrids that don't require plug-in, where are they located on this?
They aren't,
Okay,
yeah.
so we don't account for those.
Well, so it depends on which piece you're talking about. Largely, we don't account for them. So in the projections, because of the nature of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 legislation, in fact, plug-in hybrid also after model year 2026, I believe, has to be 50 miles per gallon or greater. So there are distinctions within that sort of defined it for us. So it's battery electric, plug-in hybrid, greater than 50 miles per gallon in terms of our projections. And so to simplify things, we also looked at primarily plug-in hybrid and battery electric when we were exploring incentives as well. There are states that do have what we would call sort of alternative fuel vehicle fees. And so that's sort of what we meant by propulsion when we were talking about that. So it could be a fuel cell, it could be CNG, there's some other technologies that might fall under alternative fuel vehicles.
Okay, thank you. And the only other question, this is probably a question for Chrissy. Do we know by county where these registrations are?
Yes.
Be interesting seeing.
We do, yes, and it's
Thank you.
publicly available, so it's tracked. There is a MDOT website, a dashboard that actually tracks by county the EV registrations over time. It also has publicly available charging infrastructure located there, so you can see that. And MVA shares the data on Maryland's open data portal every month.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The utility companies so that they have access to that and obviously make infrastructure related improvements.
Commissioner Fillmore?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. I had a question about something that sort of jumped out at me from the EV fee impact studies that are listed. And just looking at the title of the study, the one that caught my eye was Rising Trend of Punitive Fees on Electric Vehicles, right? And I realize that is their language, not yours. But it raised the question of, obviously I don't believe anyone on this commission is interested in reviewing punitive fees, right? We're talking about ways to make sure everyone's paying their fair share, right? So that raises the question, in any of the states that you looked at, were you able to, or what data were you able to collect about how the registration fees for electric vehicles or the electric vehicle fees compare to what a typical, and I'm not sure how you define typical, but what a typical internal combustion engine car would pay in gas taxes in that state, right? Like how do the fees compare to what they're supposedly in lieu of?
We didn't actually examine that. We zeroed in on Maryland, and one of the principles behind all of these fees is to recover user fees, right? So in other words, to make up for what these users would have paid otherwise under the gas tax. So I think that's the mentality which with policymakers moved fees forward. However, what the Consumer Reports article and analysis points out is some of them appear to be in excess of what these users would have paid into their respective trust funds. So I think they singled out Texas, for example, as well as Georgia, right, as having punitive fees in place.
Okay,
So,
okay, thank you.
And I think Chrissy is going to handle some of that in her presentation as well. Okay. Yeah. Commissioner Henninger.
Thank you. Thank you for this great presentation. So just to confirm, there are no states, and add DC on that, in the Northeast that have implemented these fees?
There you go.
that's right.
So, right, they have proposed some of them.
Okay. And second question, has there been a suggestion of instead increasing all registration fees and actually having a rebate for EVs instead?
As far as I know, it's not something that MDOT has developed. So
I'm not an economist, but I did go to the University of Maryland, College Park, and get an economics degree. And I think my Econ 101 and 201 professors are yelling, yes, every fee will affect the market in one way, shape, or form. So if we want people to buy EVs, I would seriously consider increasing across the board instead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Hershey.
Thank you very much. This may be in response a little bit to the last question, that from a policy perspective, we've almost taken a carrot and stick approach to forcing Marylanders to purchase electric vehicles. So right now we're in the incentive programs, right, where we are providing what's available from the federal tax credit. And then Maryland has a credit allowance, but specifically, how are those dollars realized by the individual? Because I've heard that, for instance, you negotiate a vehicle to be $60,000. You're not removing $8,000 off the price of the vehicle in the showroom and financing or paying for a $52,000 vehicle. Is that right? When's the federal tax credit show up in the person's pocket, and when does the Maryland credit allowance show up?
I can't speak to Maryland, but I can say that thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, that you can actually see the credit federally as a rebate. So you no longer have to wait for your tax return in order to see the financial benefit.
So that can happen immediately. And the Maryland?
I don't know about Maryland. With federally, yes.
I got the person.
Maryland
that
is
does.
after the fact.
After the
So it is based on the legislature created the base purchase price. That's the prominent price on the window, and ours is a different versus $50,000 versus the 60,000. So it is a little confusing for the buyer. They have to figure out which tax credit based on which.
Okay, so it's not all a rebate at the time of sale, correct? Okay, and then in all of your analysis that took into effect what the states are doing, and we see that more states or a number of states have added. Do we know, or did your study unveil if the fees appeared to be higher or lower the more recently that they enacted this? In other words, did we see several years ago, okay, maybe they initiated $100 to, $110, $120, but more recently when the states enacted this, it was closer to the 200 or 220 range. Do we know what each state did as far as the timing on when it occurred, the legislation?
Yeah, so we did not put together any graphics on this, and there are 33 states that have adopted, right? So what I can say is that Georgia had adopted pretty early and they adopted pretty high. A lot of states have revisited what they adopted if they adopted early. So Missouri was a good example, right? They adopted in 2000, they revisited in 2021 to account for the changing in adoption and revisiting the fees. So I would not say that the higher fees have been adopted necessarily more recently, but states do leave some room to reevaluate.
Okay. Now I guess kind of to my more stick analogy, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 is modeled after California and requires, right, automobile dealerships to sell a certain amount of electric vehicles. And I think the 2031 is 75%. So if they're required to sell a certain amount, then in a sense, you're requiring Marylanders to buy electric vehicles if they have to sell 75% of the new vehicles have to be electric vehicles. First of all, is Maryland the only other state that followed California, or were there others that did that as well?
Yeah, there were several other states that adopted California standards and had in the past as well. So Maryland had adopted California standards previously. This is just the newest iteration, the Advanced Clean Cars 2.
Correct. And in doing so, are they following California exactly? I mean, or are they, again, we call it the ACC2, but is it exactly the same as California, or are there different iterations of that?
No, it is pretty much exactly the same except for the enactment, because they have to give the automakers time to make that adjustment. But the Clean Air Act prohibits having multiple laws around vehicle sales, right, and vehicle manufacturing, and that's to prevent, each individual state having different standards for motor vehicles. So there's the federal standard and there's California standard. So you can either, as a state, adopt the federal standard or the California standard, and you cannot really change that.
Right, that's allowed under the Clean Air Act, and what you have is states on the eastern seaboard, especially the Northeast, as well as western coast states, all following suit with California.
Mhm.
So if a state doesn't follow California, it's required to follow federal, which is considered less stringent than California, or put it this way, the goals are not as high as what California's goals are. Is that right?
Yes, currently,
Currently,
yes.
yes. Yep.
And it doesn't prevent, I guess, do we think, going back to the economics question, do we think that there will be, is there a process, and maybe this is better for Chrissy now I'm thinking about it, but is there a process to buy a vehicle in a state elsewhere and then bring that state into Maryland? I mean, I would imagine that we would see that if there are people that frankly just don't want an electric vehicle, they want something else. I would imagine that would happen in some form or fashion.
That's speculative, but it's entirely possible, which is
Yeah.
why it's to our benefit if neighboring states also follow suit with California.
If that's what people wanted, correct, but not sure that that's what everybody wanted. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you both very much. Appreciate that. I think we're officially now going to put Chrissy at the table for the next presentation. So. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Chrissy Nizer, MBA Administrator. Thank you for the opportunity to provide some additional context. So we'll start off just talking about vehicle registration fees. And I know everybody assumes that they know everything they need to know about vehicle registration fees because we all pay them, right? In one form or another, but we thought it might be helpful just to walk you through what goes into those registration fees, because you pay the total amount as the consumer, but the reality is it is not just transportation trust fund revenue. The legislature has deemed that there's some additional fees that would be helpful to be captured through that registration fee. And so you can see the fees are paid on a 2-year basis. There are some allowances for individuals to get a 1-year registration if there's a financial need that we work with the customer on. But generally speaking, the vast majority of our customers pay that 2-year registration fee. And as you can see, our classes are really based on the weight of a vehicle, and they've been pretty set for a long time in terms of whether the vehicle is more or less than 27,000 pounds. That's one of the big dividing points. So in addition to that registration fee, you also pay $34. That's for the 2 years. So that includes a $29 for the Maryland Emergency Medical Services Operational Fund and $5 for the Maryland Trauma Physician Services Fund. So we just are a disbursement to those funds. We send the revenue directly to them to use for those purposes. Obviously, you can see what the revenues go to. That includes our medevac helicopters, ambulance, fire equipment, trauma units, and such. And so we don't get any of that. There's no administrative fee for collecting that, just goes right through. There are also additional fees depending on what tags you have. So just a point here, if you have Chesapeake Bay tags, if you have agricultural plates, if you have various organizational plates, you might pay some extra fees. Again, those go to the organizations, and we are that pass-through fund for collection. And so here's a little bit of context just in terms of registration fees and revenue. So you can see in FY25, the estimate of $414 million. There are some additional statutory requirements in terms of where that funding goes. And so the Automotive Safety Enforcement Division of the Maryland State Police Commercial Vehicle Safety Division gets $54 million. That's as FY25. And then there's also a little bit of funding, $0.6 million in FY23 for the Maryland Department of Environment, and that supports hazardous materials safety inspectors. As of that remaining $360 million, $65 million goes to local governments through highway user grants, and the remaining $295 used department-wide for various transportation needs. And so we had a lot of conversation about this. I won't go too much in depth, but again, just making the point that there are actions that have been taken by other states, and that's why we want to make sure that the information is in front of you so you can look at what the options might be and provide us some additional guidance if you'd like us to go back and run some additional scenarios. Considerations, the ability to estimate revenue from the various fees, some of it, whether we're looking at weight, making sure those weight fees are accurate. If the registration fees are going to exist like they do today every 2 years, that can be a financial burden even for those paying today. If there are additional fees put on top of it, do we need to look at that a little differently? Should we consider annual fees? As you heard presented earlier, I think there are only 2 that weren't annual fees, 2 that were biannual. So obviously fiscal consideration for the taxpayer who needs to pay that. Factoring in the vehicle weight, relating in, I think the point was made earlier, damage on the roadway, should that be a consideration? We do know electric vehicles are heavier. How should that factor in? Higher mile per hour gas vehicles, obviously those are efficient as well and not paying in as much revenue necessarily to the Transportation Trust Fund. And what is that appropriate ratio? It really is a policy decision for this commission to make recommendations and then ultimately the legislature to decide on. Obviously, we have major climate and equity goals that have been put forward. And so we want to consider those too. As been said, we don't want to disincentivize the very thing that we're trying to incentivize. And so here are some different options for your consideration, looking at different ways that you could price something out, an additional fee. So you could look at fuel source, right? Is it a plug-in electric or electric vehicle? And just do a flat fee across the board. We obviously have a lot of information in terms of that. And so the ability to implement that fairly quickly is something that's a positive and for your consideration, certainly. That would also enable revenue that's not being realized today to be found, again, fairly quickly. Looking at weight, so we could institute an additional flat fee for very heavy vehicles. Again, with the concept that we want to make sure that whatever's on the roadway is paying for any damage or support that's necessary. We believe that's implementable in the near future. We would just want to make sure that our weights are really accurate, because obviously that's not something that we base a fee on now. Classes are pretty broad. You get registered at a certain weight and you stay there. It's not something that we go back and reanalyze. We would want to go through that process before implementing. Consideration of maybe that's a certain weight starting at, right? We put out there maybe 7,000 or 8,000 at that higher weight, maybe a time that we want to take a consideration of that. In terms of fuel source, instituting an additional flat fee for hybrids. That was talked about a little bit today. So we're talking about non-plug-in electric vehicles, non-electric vehicles. Again, that could be implemented in the near future because we know what they are. We know where they are in the fleet, and that's certainly a consideration. Fuel economy, so additional fees based on miles per gallon. Again, very efficient, not paying as much gas tax, and we'll show some numbers on that in the next slide. Obviously, that's a lot of consideration there in terms of making sure that we have the numbers right, and where that right pressure point, I guess, is to get that additional revenue. Administrative, I alluded to this earlier, so allowing for the potential of annual registration fees as opposed to the biannual. Again, just concerns about equity and ability to pay might be something that you would want to make recommendations on. Here's some information. I think this was alluded to earlier. If we possibly could see some estimates in terms of how much people pay for motor fuel tax. So you can see a few different models here based on the 47 cents Maryland gas tax, depending on how many miles you drive. Depending on how many miles you get per gallon, you can see where it falls in terms of the amount per year average gas tax being paid. And then you can see in the bottom, estimating $220 on average for gas tax. So again, I want to stress these are really options. These are considerations to put out for you. And I think we want to hear your feedback so we can go back if there's other models that you'd like to see us run or other analysis for us to do. Right here shows a flat fee of $200 just for ease. That is looking at both electric vehicles and plug-in electric vehicles. I will note that because we've talked a lot about the goals, this does assume that we reach our goal of 600,000 vehicles by 2030. So that's 600,000 by 2030. And it's based on revenue in those years. So this is where we would wind up from a revenue standpoint if we were to implement across the board that 200 for both of those vehicle types. This shows just a slightly different model. Obviously differences, acknowledging the difference between an electric vehicle versus a plug-in electric vehicle. This one shows the 200 for the flat EV and 100 for the plug-in electric vehicle. So again, these are just options for the commission to consider. Be happy to answer any questions. And certainly if there are additional modeling that you'd like us to go back and have staff run, happy to do that as well.
Great. This is very helpful, and I think I want to echo what Administrator Neiser had to say, which is, really looking for feedback from this group. I just want to sort of reground the commission in terms of, there was a specific charge asked for us to look at the weakness in the trust fund, which we heard in the first meeting, and that weakness is in the decrease in revenue from the motor vehicle tax. And we are also supposed to look at other states and what they're doing in this area. So there's really, looking at the, and again, I'm not, trying to read to the end, but in terms of getting options and recommendations on the table, as our work is really, in hyper speed here to try to, be as helpful as possible, we can make recommendations that the General Assembly should require a fee for EV and hybrid drivers, or we can recommend that the General Assembly authorize MDOT to collect fees, or we could determine not to make a recommendation. I don't think that's where we land, but I just want to have a robust discussion along that lines. And I'm also, as you know, as Chrissy indicated, you know, really looking for folks' feedback in that regard. And it probably can't all happen here. But I think, you know, to the extent that commissioners can provide feedback in that regard would be very helpful, as the staff is going to be working to try to put something together in short order so we can report back to the General Assembly in January of 2024. So with that as the preface, we will jump to Commissioner Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about administrative. So you're the perfect person, Madam Administrator, to help me on page 21, where you talk about allow for annual registration payments. Of course, you usually every other year, you send me a little year sticker. Annual is probably better than charging someone $400 at one time, but could you go even into smaller payments and allow someone to pay, you know, quarterly? I mean, for a lot of people, $200 at one time is a lot.
Certainly it's implementable. What we'd have to look at is the administrative costs, as you know, the mailings and sending out stickers, assuming we still do stickers, registration stickers going forward, then that would be a cost every time. We do email notices, but then if you don't respond to the email notice, we do send a paper mailing because we know certain people don't have email and we want to make sure they get our notices. So there's just costs administrative, but we could certainly look at that and see. There's no limit in terms of what we could or couldn't do. In fact, what we thought about is that we could offer 1 year standard, but you could still pick a 2 year because maybe some people prefer that. They don't want to have to remember to do it every year or have the notice come.
Yeah, I guess I'm more concerned with people who need to pay a little bit less at a time than the people who are able to pay more at a time and them remembering. One of the problems with VMT, a different model, but one that, you know, we've talked a lot about, is that the administrative costs are incredibly complex and difficult and expensive. This seems so simple because you're mailing me all the time anyway, or emailing now. So I'm just trying to figure out if there's a way we can make it, to your point about equity, a little bit easier for people who need smaller bites.
Yeah, I think certainly we could look at a 6-month increment or whatever you would think is appropriate. There's not a limitation. It's just slightly more cost, that's all.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Henninger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And could you review just one more time, what are the options that this commission has in terms of this matter?
In my, I mean, again, this is my general thinking relative to this, is that, you know, clearly we could make recommendations that the General Assembly should require a fee for EV and hybrid drivers, and or could prescribe that, you know, that they take a look at that. Or we can recommend that the General Assembly authorize MDOT to collect fees on EVs and hybrids and allow MDOT to think through these things on their own. Or we could decide that we're not going to make a recommendation in this regard. Or somewhere, again, this is, you know, this is a conversation starter. So I just, you know, I just wanted to sort of ground the conversation in terms of, you know, what the charge is to the commission and, you know, how we're going to proceed together along those lines.
Thank you. And the reason why I ask is I don't hear you saying we could put it forward a recommendation that we increase fees across the board for all cars. Is that outside of the bounds of this commission?
No, we can do that.
Okay. Well, I mean, just to put some numbers behind that way of thinking, because I am seeing $414 million expected from the current protocols in 2025. And these additional fees of $200 per year for EV owners would bring in around $80 to $100 million by the end of this decade. So for a $25 increase across the board, we would get the same amount of new revenue as opposed to a $400 increase in biannual terms on EV owners. And if that aligns with our climate goals, then I would be as surprised as you are. Thank you.
Commissioner Bido.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Wasn't up this soon. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me. And Chrissy, thank you for your presentation. So I guess I don't understand all the terminology. Where's the hybrid that's not a plug-in? Where's the gas-powered hybrid in your
We didn't
calculation?
do a model that's shown here, but certainly in terms of the options, as the chair said, you could decide to charge the same fee for electric vehicle plug-in electric vehicle, charge a different fee per hybrid. There are some states that have charged fees for all the vehicles that fall into those three buckets. Really is a policy decision of where you think the fee should go based on the loss to the TTF that's currently being experienced.
I mean, it gets complicated when you have all the different layers, but I was doing my calculation and I'll pay like $160 in gas taxes this year. Doesn't seem fair that I would be charged the same, and it's a not plug-in hybrid. Doesn't seem fair to be charged the same as a plug-in. However, I also realize I'm not paying the same fees as someone who's not using a hybrid at all. So it just seems like there's a lot of layers to consider. And I hate to say this, but maybe one fee across the board is the way to handle it. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Winstead?
Missy, you had I think it was page 18, you talked about the vehicle registration revenues. And of the 414 million, I think 65 goes to highway user, to the local jurisdictions. How do you project, as you all look at revenue projections, types of cars, weight, electric versus gas, what do you see as a projection of that highway user? I know that it did not get funded for quite a number of years and then it's back in. What's your sense of where that would go if sort of projected sales and registration remain going forward? Is it hopefully liable to go up, or what's your sense of that?
Well, certainly the legislature can make different policy decisions about the split, right? That goes to the local governments versus what stays for the state transportation trust fund. In terms of the revenue for the registration fees, generally it's been fairly stable. Of course, during COVID, we saw some impacts there, but since then it has rebounded. And so generally registration fees and vehicle sales do kind of, the economy impacts it, right? If there's various incentive programs or more cash for clunkers. Thank you. So that incentivizes sales, right? There's things that happen in the marketplace, but overall it's fairly stable. Other than that, and there is and I'm happy to send it to staff. I think it's sent out. There's actually a monthly vehicle sale data on our website, which shows by new and used vehicles and the cost of the vehicle, right? So it gives you a sense of excise tax that's coming in, and then registration comes from there too.
But generally you project it.
Yes, I mean, that's something that certainly our finance team does on a regular basis. They watch the data and they understand how that's going to impact the transportation trust fund.
Okay, and then your chart on methods of rate setting, where you look at the average motor vehicle fuel payment. Unfortunately, aren't we sort of faced with light trucks consuming the lower end of that miles per gallon, but contributing more? I mean, that's really been the growth, hasn't it? Is in light trucks consuming more gas, not less, right?
Certainly. And I mean, definitely seen a growth in crossovers, right, which fall into our multi-purpose classification from a vehicle standpoint. So there's been a tremendous growth in that market in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's sort of the dominant set of the market.
It is.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Scott?
Yes, thank you. Chrissy, you mentioned ease of implementation as a one factor that we need to be looking at. In the earlier presentation, we heard about Hawaii offering an option for folks to do a mileage-based fee instead of just the regular annual fee. Do we have any sense of what the cost of implementing a mileage-based system would be for Maryland?
Certainly there are various states that have done either pilots or even full implementation. I think Virginia to our south is a good example. They've actually gotten a full implementation. I think it's an opt-in program where, you have the choice as a consumer if that's what you want to do. In most of those programs, the cost is fairly significant. I think it's at best break even standpoint. Because just initially the setup of the program and getting the data and the information on a regular basis is challenging. And so maybe as we move forward with technology, that won't be the case, but at least in most of the states that I've looked at, that's what I've seen. Would you agree with that?
Thank you. Commissioner Kirchhoff.
Just a couple items. As far as for the commission as a whole, I think when we first started, somebody had mentioned talking about a different form of revenue altogether. I mean, right now we're only talking about user fees as a way to fund the gas tax. Is that, maybe that's the first step, is do we want to still rely on user fees as a way to pay for this, which is much more aggressive tax and something that really doesn't impact the different communities that are lower income, in particular, the 7 or 8 counties we have that get disparity grants, how this would impact them. Then I'd like to get some feedback eventually from the Department of Commerce on some of the choices that we look at, because we really I haven't seen that mentioned in some of the literature we've looked at. Is, our county's big logistic distribution county. We rely a lot on transportation. I'd like to kind of know the pros and the cons of the different sources of user tax revenue we may be looking at, and whether or not that goes against or for the goals of Maryland and what industries they're trying to attract and target. So it's just something we need to kind of factor in here that we haven't really seen that done yet.
Got it. Thank you. Commissioner Sakata.
Thank you, Administrator Nizer and everybody else. I appreciate it. Obviously, for a lot of us, it's been a tough day. Thank you for commenting on Executive Director Sagal. My comment, and I've learned a lot in these commission hearings. I appreciated, by the way, Henninger's comment there about increasing all reg fees and not directly assigning those to one mode or the other. Initially it's hey, they aren't paying, if EVs aren't paying their fair share, right? Or anything, let's be honest. So, but they are doing it good. They're doing their climate. We're meeting those goals there. The adoption rate, as we've seen from their testimony, how it's speculative is it going to really affect it, change nominally. So number one, I would vote, if we are voting for some type of fee for EVs, but all, I think, vehicles. I think I'd like to kind of flesh Commissioner Henninger's thought on everybody's a little further. So it's kind of my own comment. First comment. Second comment was, has other states done any analysis on these heavier vehicles and how they affect the roadway?
I think, not sure about other states, but I know State Highway Administration certainly looks at vehicles. And I think what they tend to see is it's really the larger trucks that do more significant damage. As you start looking in the 5,000 versus 6,000 or 7,000, the damage created by that higher increment is fairly small. So it's really hard to quantify at those lower levels.
Thank you. Commissioner Feldmark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Nizer, for the presentation and the data you shared. The conversation has raised a question in my mind. I'm not sure if you're the right person to ask, but I'll put it out there. I know we've talked about the decreasing revenue from the gas tax. I don't believe I've seen, maybe we've had it and I've missed it, but I don't believe I've seen sort of a breakdown of how much of that is attributed to hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles versus just general improvements in fuel efficiency. And I don't know what that allocation would be, if that data is available. But as we look at, as we think about what represents fairness, I'm just curious.
So we'll have to probably get back to you with that data. That's more comptroller office data. We don't get the gas tax information broken down that way, but I'm sure we can follow up and see what level of detail that we could get.
Yeah, I think there was information in the second meeting along those lines, but we can resurface that for you. Sure, absolutely. And Commissioner Tolgan, you have the last bite of the apple.
Comment and a question. So first, just any further analysis, I think that we take on either as a commission, I hope we can also just look at accompanying both greenhouse gas emissions, but also air pollution. The majority of Marylanders live in counties that violate the 8-hour ozone standard, and automobile pollution is one of the contributing factors. So again, just thinking about any of the costs of gasoline powered vehicles from an air pollution and health standpoint is important for us to find out how to balance the ledger. I'm curious if there's been any investigation of a way to apply a fee to home charging infrastructure. So if a person purchase an electric vehicle and they have a charger at home. I don't know if you can differentiate that, but we already have a lot of through the, I think, Empower Maryland program, there's, some standard of a user benefit fee or some fee. Obviously, that doesn't go into the Transportation Trust Fund, but if we're thinking big picture out to 2035, is that something that's worth exploring?
I know the Maryland Energy Administration has some tax credits that go towards the installation of the charging capability at the home. In terms of the power that's paid, I think that goes through your normal power bill. I don't think there's any differentiation of that, but certainly if there was a consideration, I guess we'd have to talk to the Public Service Commission about how we could differentiate the charging for the vehicle versus home charging. I'm not sure how that would work.
I think there's some technologies, because occasionally if you get your bill, they'll break down, a hypothetical based on your
Right.
fridge and other stuff, but just at that point, it's probably the simplest equivalent of a user fee based on usage that would take into account and say size of vehicle plus mileage.
Just to chime in quickly here, in the studies that we put up earlier, that some states have looked at this and found it difficult to administer.
I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's something I think the Public Service Commission might be willing to take up, because I think they're going to be looking pretty closely at EVs and charging infrastructure. So.
Thanks.
Thank you. Commissioner Kane.
Yes, I just wanted to follow up on that. I mean, gas taxes are regressive, okay? And we're trying to make these equitable. But if we could somehow tax however kilowatt hour, just like you do a gallon of gas that you use. I don't know if there's any way we can do that when you have a home charging station. Can you determine what's coming out of there or not? And when you go to a different, if you're going to Giant and you charge outside there, can you do that? Just a thought. I'm not sure how that would work, but it would seem to be a little bit more of a user fee and people paying for what they use. So.
Thank you. This has been very helpful. I think there'll probably be more, thoughts for us to consider. Again, we're trying to get, a range of options on the table. And I do, take into consideration, Commissioner Henninger's point as well. So I appreciate that. I just, again, any of the things that we're talking about is, I do want the commission to keep in mind that the deficit and the unbalanced CTP is $400 million. So without any projects, this collection alone, this fee alone is only going to be making a small dent in that overall picture. So I just, again, want to just sort of raise that to folks' consciousness. The secretary has spoken about it any number of times and is enjoying all of those conversations with our folks in the county on the road. So I just wanted to, put that out there for folks as well. So thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we are going to, we're going to move on to the tolling conversation. And I asked MDTA to present because revenues from tolling has come up in a couple of meetings. Additionally, the charge of the working group asked us to consider what other states are employing related to the tolling revenue. And I think Maryland may be missing out potentially. Again, I was talking to Ms. Sharpless earlier on. Before we delve into it more, I just wanted to preface it that I have asked the AG's office for an opinion on whether we can legally do this. So I should have that by the next meeting, which I will obviously circulate, but I just wanted to, kind of put that on people's radar screen. So with that, I will kick it over to Ms. Sharpless to make the presentation.
Good afternoon. If we could wait 1 second for the presentation. It looks like this. Thank you for your patience. For the record, I'm Deb Sharpless, MDTA's Chief Financial Officer. We've been asked to provide an overview of the MDTA. We understand that the commission members' knowledge about MDTA varies. So for some, you may be hearing information that you are already aware of. So. Sorry, that's. Okay, so beginning on slide 2, today's presentation begins with an overview of MDTA's 9 toll facilities, including the toll revenue these facilities generate, toll payment methods, and discount plans available to customers. Next, I will focus on the outflow of funds from our operating and capital budgets, and then I'll move on to MDTA's governance and financial structure, and then conclude with key takeaways. The presentation also includes a few supplemental slides. I do not plan on discussing these slides unless there are specific questions regarding them. So MDTA has 9 toll facilities, and from the map, you can see these facilities are primarily on the Western Shore with a concentration in the Baltimore area and along the I-95 corridor, the East Coast most vital interstate. In some materials, you might see us talk about 8 facilities. This is because the I-95 express toll lanes are a facility within a facility. From a trust agreement perspective, the ETLs are part of the JFK Memorial Highway. So I just wanted to mention that in case you hear me toddle back and forth between 8 and 9. So the average age of MDTA's existing facilities is approximately 42 years old. A substantial portion of our facilities are elevated structures or have substantial bridge decks. MDTA's infrastructure accounts for 35% of all state-owned bridge decks. For perspective, this equates to more than 15 million square feet or a single road stretching from the State House to Central Park in New York. Our oldest facility, the Thomas J. Hayden Memorial Bridge, opened in 1940. The Hayden Bridge opened just 4 months prior to MDTA's first signature structure replacement, the original Governor Harry W. Nice Memorial Senator Thomas Mack Middleton Bridge. I know it's a mouthful. The new bridge opened in 2022. Most of our infrastructure was designed with a 50-year service life. So expanding on our facilities on slides 4 and 5. From a lane mile perspective, MDTA's largest facility is the JFK Memorial Highway, I-95, which stretches from the northeast side of Baltimore City to the Delaware state line. The JFK facility has more than the JFK facility includes the Tidings Bridge, which is nearly a mile long and more than 120 feet above the Susquehanna River. Lastly, as I just stated a second ago, JFK also includes the express toll lanes. The next facility is the Thomas J. Hayden Memorial Bridge, which also crosses the Susquehanna River. Next, we have 3 other facilities that we call the harbor crossings. The first 2 are the Fort McHenry Tunnel and Baltimore Harbor Tunnel, which I'll address on this slide, and then we'll move to the next slide where we talk about the Francis Scott Key Bridge. So the Fort McHenry Tunnel is the largest of MDTA's 2 tunnels. Commonly, you'll hear us refer to it as FMT. At the time of construction, the Fort McHenry Tunnel was the world's largest underwater tunnel, as well as the widest vehicular tunnel that was built using the emerged tube method. The tunnel itself has 8 lanes and is nearly 1.4 miles long. The entire Fort McHenry Tunnel toll facility is approximately 10.3 miles. Except for the tunnel, nearly the entire facility is elevated structures. The facility begins on I-95 by Caton Avenue and extends north where it connects to JFK. The second harbor crossing is the Baltimore Harbor Tunnel, MDTA's 3rd oldest facility. The harbor tunnel has 4 lanes and is also nearly 1.4 miles long. The entire facility is 18.5 miles in length and commonly referred to as I-895. The average age of the 63 bridges on this facility is more than 58 years old, whereas the theoretical design life of most of these bridges was 50 years. Now, maintaining these facilities and these tunnels goes far beyond the roadway and the bridge structures that we all see. For example, both tunnels have ventilation buildings with a total of 80 fresh air and exhaust fans. The FMT fan drums are nearly 9 feet tall. The replacement of the harbor tunnel fans and the refurbishment of the FMT fans costs nearly $100 million, which does not include maintaining the 2 electrical substations, also known as switchgears, in each vent building. Recent upgrades to the switchgears work will exceed $110 million. Moving, let's see. So the harbor crossing, the third harbor crossing is the Francis Scott Key facility. This facility is more than just its namesake. The facility has 22 bridges and with an average age of almost 45 years and crosses 3 bodies of water, Bear Creek, Patapsco River, and Curtis Creek. The facility extends from 695 in Edgemere in Baltimore County to Glen Burnie in Anne Arundel County and includes a portion of Broning Highway in Dundalk. The next toll facility is the William Preston Lane Jr. Memorial Bay Bridge, which is one of the nation's most famous bridges. It's a dual-span bridge that connects Maryland's Eastern Shore and Western Shore. Currently, NEPA Tier 2 Bay Crossing study is underway. The study was requested by Queen Anne's and Anne Arundel counties and received support letters from 12 counties and Ocean City. The next facility is the Nice Middleton Bridge, which spans the Potomac River between Newburgh, Maryland, and Dahlgreen, Virginia. The Nice Middleton new bridge opened to traffic in October 2022. The project cost $490 million, and the bridge opened early and on budget. The last facility is the Intercounty Connector, also known as the ICC, or Maryland 200. The 19-mile roadway opened in segments. The first segment opened in February 2011, and the final segment in November 2014. The ICC was Maryland's first all-electronic toll road. The $2.4 billion project was funded through a composition of funds. And then moving on to slide 6, we begin to look at MDTA's revenue and transactions. In fiscal year 23, 163 million toll transactions generated toll revenue totaling nearly $800 million. 2-axle vehicles account for 93% of total transactions and 67% of revenue, whereas 3+ axle vehicles account for 33% of revenue and 7% of traffic. These variances are driven by 2-axle discount programs, such as the Easy Pass regional commuter plans and the Easy Pass Maryland discount, as well as 3-axle toll rates are a multiplier of the 2-axle rate. The Fort McHenry Tunnel and JFK Memorial Highway generate the highest annual revenue. From a trip perspective, the Fort McHenry has the most trips, closely followed by JFK, the Harbor Tunnel, the ICC, and Bay Bridge. In 2023, roughly 86% of total toll payments were made via Easy Pass. Now, slide 7 addresses customer toll payment methods. In Maryland, customers are provided 3 payment methods: Easy Pass, Pay by Plate, and video tolling. Easy Pass is the largest, most successful interoperable toll collection system in the world. The states shaded in purple reflect where Easy Pass is accepted. The number of participating toll agencies continue to grow. Today, there are in excess of 37 million customer Easy Pass accounts, of which 2 million are Maryland accounts. The Easy Pass group, a 36-member group, is working hard to expand interoperability with other tolling regions across the country and to allow mobile app providers to participate in the Easy Pass network. Maryland's newest payment method is Pay by Plate. With Pay by Plate, the customer registers a credit card associated with a vehicle's license plate. When the customer travels through an MDTA toll facility, the credit card is charged. The payment method does not require a prepaid balance as Easy Pass does. The final payment method is video tolls. A customer's video tolls when they don't pay their toll via Easy Pass or Pay by Plate. Sorry, I'm trying to get over a cold. The customer is mailed a notice of toll due essentially an invoice. The toll is also posted on Drive Easy MD, and when the customer pays the toll prior to the issuance of the notice of toll due, the customer is given a 15% discount. Video tolling is a good payment method. We see pay by plate as a better payment method, and Easy Pass is the best payment method. And toll rates that are charged reflects that. Okay, Slide 8 highlights several other discounts we make available to customers, starting with 2-axle vehicles. The MDTA offers customers 4 discount programs. First, the regional commuter plans, in which customers purchase 25 round trips that must be used within 45 days. Customers' tolls are 65% off the base toll rate. In fiscal year 2023, regional commuters saved nearly $60 million by utilizing their plans. Next, we have the Hatem Bridge Plan. This is an annual unlimited trip plan for $20 per year. Customers can make unlimited trips across the Hatem Bridge. We also offer the Bay Bridge Shoppers Plan. For this plan, customers purchase 10 trips that must be used within 90 days for $20. The trips are valid Sunday through Thursday. And lastly, the largest discount is for any Easy Pass Maryland account holder. You can receive a 25% discount off your 2-axle tolls when the customer maintains their account in good standing, meaning there's funds on their account, and when they properly mount their transponder. In fiscal year 23, customers saved $43.2 million in tolls. The MDTA also offers several 3+ axle discounts. Post usage and the supplemental discount programs are just that, they're rebate programs. Customers can earn rebates based on the toll amount they paid and the number of times the vehicle used an MDTA facility. In fiscal year 23, MDTA rebated back to 5-axle vehicles $99.5 million. Lastly, we have the Harbor Tunnel, Child Street, and Key Bridge Bear Creek discount program, in which vehicles pay $2 per axle. This program provides discounts ranging from 25% to 60%. The more axles, the greater the discount. When possible, the MDTA tries to have discount programs that benefit Marylanders. However, it's critical to recognize that we do not limit access to these discounts to Maryland residents. That is, we do not have in-state and out-of-state toll rates or discount programs. Anyone can receive these discounts if they have a Maryland Easy Pass account. A Maryland Easy Pass account is not restricted to individuals or companies that reside in Maryland. To do so would pose significant legal risk, including constitutional challenge. So on slides 9 and 10, we shift to the outflow of funds. MDTA's fiscal year 24 budget is $400.1 million. The graphs provided in your materials categorize the budget by expense category and area of responsibility. Personnel expenses is the most significant budget driver. MDTA has 1,697 dedicated employees, of which 477 are sworn officers. Personnel expenses account for 55% of the total operating budget. Contractual services represents 35% of the total budget. Contractual services such as infrastructure repairs, bridge and tunnel inspections, on-call repairs, credit card fees, Easy Pass transponders, and the tolling system are all significant budget drivers. From an area of responsibilities perspective, 51% of the operating expenses relate to facilities, operations, and maintenance, followed by law enforcement at 31% and general administration at 18%. MDTA's proposed final 6-year capital budget totals $3.1 billion. The tables provide categorizing the budget by facility and type of project. From a facilities perspective, I-95 and the express toll lanes account for roughly 32% of the budget. This is driven by the northbound ETL project that is extending the current ETLs from Maryland 43 in White Marsh in Baltimore County to north of Maryland 24 in Harford County. A large percentage of the budget also falls into the category of multi-area. Multi-area is any project that impacts more than one facility, and as well as priority one work that was recently added to the budget and has not been assigned to the category of work. From a project category perspective, structure preservations represents more than 1/3 of the budget, followed by safety and capacity improvements and highway preservations. New projects are funded based on 6 factors. Inspection findings carry the most weight in prioritizing projects. MDTA's trust agreement with its bondholders require independent engineers to inspect the facilities annually, and that the facilities must be maintained in good repair, working order, and in a state of good repair. In compliance with our trust agreement and TIFIA loan with Federal Highway, the inspection reports are filed with the trustee and Federal Highway Administration. We also have a robust life cycle and asset management system that allows us to plan and prioritize work and lower our overall capital expenses required to maintain the facilities in a state of good repair by allowing us to do the right projects at the right time. Other factors considered equally are regulatory compliance, safety and capacity needs, statewide initiatives, and local priorities. With regard to local priorities, 2 examples of local priorities being addressed are Cecil County asked for the Belvedere interchange. This is a new access point along I-95. We worked with the county to help them secure a grant, and MDTA funded the majority of the project costs. The Nice Middleton Bridge is another example of the county priority that was advanced ahead of the original replacement schedule. So now we transition over to governance. The MDTA is a non-budgeted agency, and it has an 8-citizen member board that, as well as the chairman, the Secretary of Transportation, who serves as the governance for the MDTA. The board sets policy, they make decisions, and they are our governing body. They are required to have certain areas of expertise, including structural engineering, transportation planning, land use planning, and finance. They have a binding fiduciary responsibility that's created in both statute as well as the trust agreement. They adopt financial policies that set standards for debt management, revenue, and investments. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk about credit ratings. These policies are a key part of our ratings. They have independent toll setting powers. No approval from any other agency or legislative body is required to adjust toll rates and fees. Also, a key consideration in our credit rating. And they reserve all rights to operate the agency, and they delegate day-to-day operations to the executive director. Without that dedication, the decision must lie with the board. So from a trust agreement perspective, the trust agreement pledges all revenue derived from transportation facilities projects. And you can generally think of a transportation facility project as a facility of the toll facility with one exception, and that's the Hayden Bridge. The Hayden Bridge is what we call a general account project, and that's why the Hayden Bridge can have the unlimited trips for $20. The trust agreement places restrictions on discounts, but since the Hayden Bridge is not a transportation facility project, we have the unlimited pass for that bridge. The trust agreement sets forth the terms and conditioning governing the use of funds, operating budgets, debt. It requires a budget to be adopted by July 1st. It prohibits free passage and non-uniform tolls. It places conditional restrictions upon the use of revenue outside the trust estate, establishes a rate covenant, and it dictates the disposition of revenue, also known as the flow of funds. In your supplemental materials, additional information about flow of funds. In statute, the transportation article. It acknowledges the trust agreement as a contractual legal obligation. And it limits our authority, the MDTA's authority to finance, construct, maintain, and operate transportation facility projects and only transportation facility projects. Failure to comply with the trust agreement may result in a credit downgrade, increase future debt issuance costs. A breach allows the trustee to declare all bonds outstanding immediately due and payable. Failure to raise tolls can require the trustee to step in and take actions that the board has failed to take, if they would do so. And also, the trust agreement failure to comply may result in legal actions by bondholders. So this slide may be somewhat familiar to you. When MDOT did their overview, I think they had a similar slide. And this is just showing where does the money come from and where is it going? And so, as I said, we're a non-budgeted agency and are supported solely by the generation of revenue with very, very few exceptions. The revenue primarily is toll revenue. There's a little bit of money from the I-95 travel plazas and a very little bit of miscellaneous revenue. We also receive some money from MDOT for police services provided at the airport and the port. What our costs are is exactly what MDOT pays. There's no overhead or anything like that. So what we receive is exactly what we paid out in officer salaries, related expenses. And so where does the money go? It goes to the capital program, debt service, reserves, and our operating budget. So from a credit rating perspective, within the universe of 50 rated toll agencies, MDTA remains one of 4 with a AA rating, which is the highest rating for the sector, and one issuer that's one notch higher. They have additional backstops for their debt. So we are rated by Moody's and Fitch. Our prudent policies significantly influence our credit rating. The rate covenant is essentially 1.2 times coverage. Our debt service policy is 2 times coverage. We have an unencumbered cash policy of $400 million, and there's a statutory bond limit of $3 billion. We also utilize a financial forecast that incorporates independent traffic and revenue projections, future borrowing costs, and current and anticipated operating and capital budgets. Additional information regarding the financial forecast is also in your supplemental materials. So lastly, before opening up for questions, just some key takeaways for anybody that likes the summary. MDTA is a mature, diversified system. We have experienced leadership and governance, and we have strong financial and infrastructure policies. From our financial policy to the multi-year forecasts, to the inspection program that we have that meets all national standards, to our asset management system. With those strengths, we also have challenges. In the past, we've been very resilient for the challenge that comes to us, whether it was the Great Recession, COVID, we had resiliency. The resiliency is shrinking significantly, rising operating costs, particularly personnel and insurance, construction, inflation's double digits we've been seeing. We have significant capital needs with the aging infrastructure that we have, the regulatory environment. And lastly, tolls were raised last a decade ago and then reduced in 2016. And then we had the impact from the pandemic as well. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, Deb. Appreciate it. Commissioner Ilaria.
Thanks very much for the presentation and condolences to you and your colleagues once again. Couple of quick questions. Somewhere in here it says safety and capacity improvements, highway preservation, et cetera. I guess I'm trying to understand. I have the same question in another context. What does that mean can you, for example, is widening a facility
It
fall
can-
within that even?
It certainly can be. So take by the Maryland House.
Yeah.
We're currently have a project underway where we're widening the highway there. Because when analyzing crash data, we have a higher concentration of crashes at that location. So in that situation, we're adding capacity, but we're also at the same time addressing safety concerns.
Right.
We have in the past, the original ETL projects, left exits, removing left exits from the highway. When we do something like that, that it provides a safety benefit.
So does it necessarily hang on a safety? I mean, what if you just wanted more capacity? Do you ever do that?
Generally, they go hand in hand, that when you add capacity, you usually achieve higher safety.
Mhm.
But we could, and we do, sometimes fund a project that the driver is the capacity, not the safety. But other times it can be the reverse, such as the Maryland House.
And is that decision solely within the provenance of the board to make that? I mean, I assume you need other people to cooperate in some fashion, but it's fundamentally the board's decision how to pick those projects, widen the highways and so on.
Yes, the board is responsible for approving the operating and capital budget. So as part of keeping them informed, we'll do presentations to them, such as our annual inspections. This past month, we walked through the results of our inspections. Inspections are a huge driver in deciding what projects are funded. And we'll talk about another presentation as we talk about each project that we're adding. But it starts with staff making a recommendation and then ultimately the board approving the budget.
Let me ask you two more. Thank you. Let me ask you two more quick questions about the debt. I always wonder when people are jealously guarding their debt rating, which is something it sounds like the right thing to do. But if you gave up a little bit, if you weren't the second highest rated authority in the country, but you were the fifth or the seventh, how much would what would that mean in terms of impact? Do we cost a little more to borrow, but could you borrow more? Like what's the sort of balance there?
So it's not a matter of, access to the market, right? We have the $3 billion bond cap.
Right.
So if you pay more in debt service, you're chewing away some of that, for interest that you wouldn't otherwise, pay. The cost of maintaining that rating, we have looked at that. We've examined that. Our unencumbered cash balance, it's recently been raised. We looked at, had we not raised it, we would have been downgraded. We looked at, well, what's the cost to have the reserves where the rating agencies feel they should be, which is essentially 1 times operating expenses versus the cost to carry that money. And that change that we made, it was essentially cost neutral. So in that scenario, the decision was to preserve the rating because there wasn't a cost associated that whatever we would have been paying in higher rates, is essentially the same as what it cost to maintain the higher reserve.
Thanks. And one more quick question. If you had, I know we're going to get to the revenue calculations in the next presentation, but if you had more revenue, what would you do with it? Which of those waterfall, which way does it go? Does it go towards higher bond? Could you just simply issue more bonds? You said you have a bond cap of, you just said a certain number, or would it, how would that be allocated?
So today we have $2.5 billion in outstanding debt. So when we do a forecast, 6 years published, our traffic and revenue and other forecasts are 10 years. We have, we funded the priority ones for years 6. Those priority ones extend into the next 10 years, that we just funded $360 million. If you looked at a 10-year horizon, we're over $1 billion. That doesn't count priority 2s. And before we, honestly, how things work in inflation, before we blink, priority 2s become 1s, very quickly, as soon as you have a number of years pass. So the funding for revenue, goes back into these facilities. It's a constant reinvestment.
Does it go down any particular path in those, you have that inflow and outflow chart.
Mhm.
Does it go to any particular one of those purposes? Does it allow you to issue more bonds, for example? Do you just use it for maintenance?
But we cannot exceed the $3 billion bond cap.
And that's based upon statute?
Statute, yes,
And your bond, what are you at now?
2.5.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Thank you very much.
And in the, when we have had bond issuances in the past, it is strategic. When the ICC and the ETLs were built, we went through a time period where a lot of debt was issued. Then we went through a time period where we were paying down debt, we defeased debt. We are in a bond issuance cycle now. We secured the TIFIA loan. In the coming years, you'll see us issue more bonds. And then we have to go into a mode of paying down debt again, because if we don't, everything will be pay-go.
Thank you. Commissioner Winstead.
Deborah, thank you for your presentation. On the operating budget chart, is it possible to get historic information about the split between facility operation and maintenance, which is 51%, and general administrative and enforcement costs at 49%? I think it'd be of interest just to understand how that division, what's happened over the years in terms of that division. The other, on the top line, maybe looking at with the toll facilities that you maintain, what is the impact of the life cycle, end of the life cycle, and the replacement, repair, renovation? When is that going to hit? I defended the painting of the Bay Bridge back in '98. And the comptroller asked me a question. It seems like the bridge is costing as much as we paid to get it built. The answer was yes.
And more.
Yeah, but I would just be interested in seeing, where those facilities, when they're hitting the mark of literally having major renovation, against kind of a historic spread between capital and operating maintenance versus administrative.
Right.
Thanks.
So the split between operations, maintenance, and police and administration, it's generally consistent.
Okay.
We can certainly provide the commission information, but a place where we publish that is on our website.
Okay.
Annually, we do an AFR, and in the statistical section, you'll see information like that for the last 10 years. So
thank you.
defer
Thank
to the
you.
commission whether to utilize the website, the financial statements, or if you'd like us to provide that.
Yeah, we'll provide it to the
Yeah.
commission.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then on the capital side, we have life cycle analysis for each one. And that's part of the strategic, the next major facility is the tidings. And we look at it as sort of like your own home, right? Somebody doesn't replace all their vehicles at the same time. You have to space them out. And so you saw us with the nice Middleton Bridge replacement we're to that place where you're going to have to see these significant expenses spread out for the foreseeable future, because many of these assets were designed for 50 years.
Thank you. We do have a number of questions and we still have another presentation. So I'm trying to keep this moving along. So thank you. Commissioner Flora.
Hi, thanks. I zoomed ahead to your appendix. Thank
Okay.
you. The last slide regarding essentially the potential increase for out-of-state vehicles. A couple questions. Do our neighboring states do that? Increase the amount for out-of-state vehicles?
So do you mean like where they have in-state and out-of-state toll rates?
Yeah.
There are states that have done it similar to us, right?
Okay.
This idea that the Maryland Easy Pass discount, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where if you have a Maryland account, your toll can be 25% less. Instead of paying $4 at Fort McHenry Tunnel, you pay $3. There's no restriction, there's no residencies associated with it. So, but where they an example where tolls were set differently for in-state and out-of-state. It's currently in appeal with the Circuit Court was Rhode Island, had truck tolls that were different for in-state and out-of-state. There's an injunction that, prevented them from implementing that, and that's being heard in federal court now. So because of interstate commerce laws and all.
And that's why we've asked the AG to look into this issue and provide, an opinion back. So it is something that is actively being pursued.
That's great, because I'm looking at, what the other piece of information in this puzzle for me would be the trends. What are the numbers of users over time that are in-state versus out-state? Because when I look at these numbers of 32% were out-of-state vehicles, it would be interesting to see what that trend has been over time of in-state versus out-of-state, because we're also, as we know, struggling with issues of housing and commuters. Where are people working versus where are they living? And are we becoming essentially a pass-through state of people passing through Maryland, but working elsewhere or living elsewhere, or vice versa? So that issue, and what are the trends over time? And then it would also, I think, inform, if that's the majority of our users and those folks aren't living or working here, that just tells us a lot more about other policy too, I think. So that would be a big question for me, if you have that trend data.
For in-state and out-of-state.
Right, over time, have we seen a growing increase, for instance, in out-of-state over time, or has it been pretty consistent?
No, and I don't know what materials you're looking at from when you said the supplemental.
I'm looking at your appendix, the very last slide in this
is on the
presentation.
financial forecast.
It's the out-of-state vehicle transactions.
That's the next
I'm
presentation.
sorry, I thought it was part of yours.
Yes,
I thought it was
yes,
an appendix. Never mind, I jumped ahead.
Okay, okay, but it's
So whoever's up next, be ready.
Okay.
But yeah, because I think still just more trend data generally is helpful, so we can sort of see what's happened with like remote work and everything like that, to really understand some of that trend data is going to be, I think, very helpful in this. Because of those market impacts, and kind of like the question earlier, are we seeing market shifts of what driving, users or MPG or gas or any of these things? I think it's going to inform the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Thank you. Commissioner Hershey.
Thank you very much. Notwithstanding the relatively new ICC, each one of these facilities is a water crossing except for I-95. Right, transverses water in some way, so a bridge or a tunnel. How did we get in a position where I-95 became a tolling facility? We have other interstates in the state of Maryland, obviously I-70, probably the longest, 68, parts of 70 or 81. Why are we in a position that I-95 became a toll complex, and how are the other interstates that are in Maryland maintained? What financial sources are used towards those?
So all of the toll facilities that exist today, recognizing that the current statute established MDTA in 1971, formerly state road commissions, all of the toll facilities that have been built, they were all tolled back. Revenue from one facility supported the other. When MDTA was formed, it assumed the debt from the State Road Commission. So every facility that is tolled today, it originated and was constructed through toll revenue. And I-95, that's how it was built, was based on toll revenue. And it funded 100% of that construction.
So I-95 was built after I-70 and 81 and 86?
I don't know the chronological order of all the Maryland's interstate system. What I can tell you through research is that I-95 from Delaware down to 895, 95 where it joins up, that was all 100% toll revenue funded. Is how that roadway got built, along with the Bay Bridge. Every facility was built by toll revenue or backed by toll revenue.
Okay. Do you know how did we get in a position where I-95, the tolling plaza is in Cecil County across the Tidings Bridge? And so essentially, you know, I could say a disproportionate amount of the toll revenue when you talk about Marylanders probably comes from Cecil County residents that are traveling south and coming back each day. Whereas many residents can use the rest of I-95 without paying a toll. How did we get to a point where it's just in Cecil County?
So when the agreements were reached with the federal government to build 95, part of that agreement was where the toll was located. It was that was part of the federal agreement, and it was there. And so tolls are collected northbound, not southbound. JFK is one of the facilities. We only collect tolls in one direction. And so that recognizing, and this isn't like an example where you try to do things to benefit Marylanders to the extent you can. That is why the HADEM plan exists. You know, that for, $20 unlimited trips. You know, we recognize that for some, if you are headed west in Cecil County, that you're heading east and then west. And, you know, it's without the tolls in that location, 95 may not have existed. And it's a conversation that we certainly had. The best we've done is to be able to have the unlimited plan. But we also think about the economic benefit that I-95 has provided Cecil County. Because if 95, when connecting north, it could have bypassed Cecil County. It could have went straight through Pennsylvania. So, we're getting the benefit of I-95 and all the commerce, and Belvedere is a perfect example of that in the economic development that it brings to the county. And then you try to create something that helps residents that are back and forth. And that's where the commuter plans come in, and that's where the HADEM plan comes in.
And I appreciate both of those plans. So thank you for doing those. Just another question on I-95, because and you mentioned it was 32% of the 6-year total for capital projects, including the express travel lanes. But yet the express travel lanes bring in the least amount of revenue.
That's right.
Is that ever expected to, what's the correlation between the cost of the ETLs, the revenue that's being brought in? Are they ever expected to pay for it for itself?
The cost of the ETLs first is a huge portion of whenever we report, what did the ETLs cost? Everybody looks at it as total, as if all of those costs belong to those lanes in the middle, when in actuality, it's significant improvements to what we call the general purpose lanes, removing of left exits, replacing structurally deficient bridges, replacing overpasses. All of that is included in those costs. So when you look at because the lanes themselves in the middle, that's the least of the expenses. It's all of the overpasses and the bridges and everything else on the outside that's getting replaced, and capacity, which helps any traveler on 95. So they weren't designed to recover the cost of them, because that's part of JFK. What they do is they provide a reliable trip for customers.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Ali. And we are running.
I know, in the
running
interest
out
of time, I turned mine off, but, and Senator Hershey's question kind of addressed one of mine. And I don't know, Deborah, thanks for your presentation, if you're the one to ask this question. So the elimination of the toll takers, has that proven to be significant as far as a savings perspective.
From a revenue inflow outflow perspective,
Yeah.
it's about neutral. But going AET provides environmental benefits. By the toll plazas was a high crash hotspot, you would call it. It's addressed those types of concerns. So AET, it wasn't about revenue. It improved safety. It was an environmental decision, but there's not a,
And that was my other question. Do we have any data on the safety and the reduction of congestion as a result of those
Yes.
changes?
Yes.
And I know that's not so much revenue focused, but I'd certainly be interested.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. I just want to welcome Carrie Cook and Richard Duncan from DLS, who are going to give different modeling scenarios related to revenue generated from increased tolling. Thank you both.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Carrie Cook from the Department of Legislative Services.
Hi, and I am Richard Duncan from the Department of Legislative Services. So just for a little background, we were asked at DLS to do kind of a pro forma analysis for the commission, just to get an idea of the magnitude of what, how much money would be raised if there was a toll increase to, in part, support the transportation system more broadly, instead of just MDTA. So we're not going to touch on any of the logistical or legal issues that MDTA kind of touched on. That's not really our place to do. That might accompany, oh, you got to click, any such increase. And we had a little background, but there's no way we could do justice to the great job MDTA already did explaining the system. So moving on to the numbers.
Okay, so what we did to come up with these figures is simply look at the number of transactions that occurred in fiscal 2023, which just ended this past June. So that's the column on the left-hand side there. And you can see that that's broken out by the axle of the vehicle. So in fiscal 2023, as Deb mentioned, there were 162.8 million transactions at all the MDTA facilities across the state. So the two sort of scenarios that we looked at was an incremental toll increase of 50 cents for all vehicles, and that would yield 81.4 million in additional revenue, and an increase of 25 cents per axle. So 50 cents increase for 2 axles, 75 cents for 3 axles, etc., going all the way up to $1.50 for 6 axles. And that would yield 88.8 million. And I also just wanted to flag that these figures here are additional revenue that these theoretical increases would produce. This is not adding in the actual fiscal 2023 revenue that the agency did collect. And then we also just did a quick calculation on out-of-state vehicle transactions. So as was mentioned in the previous presentation, about 33%, about a third of the transactions at MDTA facilities were from out-of-state vehicles. So we did the same thing here, just taking the out-of-state transactions only, which was about 53.5 million transactions, doing 50 cents across the board in that middle column there, which yielded 26.7 million. And then the 25 cents per axle, which yielded 31.6 million. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Commissioner Chang.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, DLS, for providing this pro forma revenue analysis. Question I have is there any data out there that's available of how much revenue we would have lost or that we did lose because of the toll reductions over the past several years?
Yes, I would be happy to get that to you.
Great. I think that will be a very important setting the context about historically where we are because of past actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I should qualify that obviously it's, a theoretical estimation of, going back and looking at the traffic that has happened in those years and then using that to calculate an estimation.
Thank you. Commissioner Hershey.
Thank you. Was I to understand your first comment was that this was to increase tolls to more broadly fund Transportation Trust Fund and not just MDTA?
That's our understanding when
That was-
the request came in, yes.
Officially reached the bad ideas category of this. Let me just go to follow up on that question, that Delegate Chang had. I'm interested in because we've talked about potentially changing the toll rates for out of, or non-resident motorists. Last report that I had, I think was through 2020, that the state was owed almost $167 million of uncollected tolls from out-of-state residences. And I think that was even growing more exponentially at almost $30 million a year when we went to to cashless tolling. If we were to go forward with this idea of changing rates for out-of-state motorists or charging them differently, do we have any type of reciprocating agreements that would allow us to collect this money? And do you know if MDTA is doing anything to collect the money that's already owed to them?
So the first part of your question, not that I'm aware of, but MDTA would have to be the best person to comment on that. I don't know if Deb is still around. She might be able to step back up and answer that question for you.
On whether there's reciprocating agreements,
yeah.
we don't even know if there are or not.
Well, they might. I
Okay.
don't think we do.
Right.
But for your second question, I'm sorry, could you repeat it? I kind of lost my train of thought there.
Well, again, that was
The reciprocating agreements.
If we don't or I guess my second part of the question was, are we doing anything, or what are we doing, or how has that amount of debt owed back to MDTA changed in the last years through collections?
We'd be happy to check in with the agency on that and get back to you, Senator.
I
Thank
do
you.
know that it is in part more difficult because for in-state drivers, MDTA has a lot of power over vehicle
Absolutely.
registrations. They can reach out to the Central Collections Union or unit within DBM and deal with those situations. But for out-of-state drivers, you're right, it has been difficult. And as Carrie said, we can reach out to the agency and get back to you on that.
Thank you. Commissioner Corman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the presentation. Do you happen to know if New York uses toll revenue for transportation needs off of the toll facilities?
I do not know that, sir.
They do. Do you happen to know if Virginia uses toll revenue for transportation needs off of the toll facilities?
I think you may know.
I suspect they do, but I don't know.
They do. How about Pennsylvania? Any idea?
Maybe yes.
Okay, this is one you probably do know. When Governor Hogan proposed putting tolls on the American Legion Bridge 495 and 270, did he say toll revenue was going to be only for that transportation facility, or were there going to be other uses for that toll revenue?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not
Oh,
sure.
well, I'll remind you, he was proposing to fund other projects off of that toll revenue as well, off of the transportation facility. So the research assignment that you were given, is it novel? Is it new? Is it something that would be unique to Maryland?
Seems like the answer is no.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner Henninger got the last bite at this one.
Thank you. So, going off that comment, but perhaps not mirroring it in style. I will just simply add that it would be very helpful to get more information about what the process would be to add additional tolls in other locations, as opposed to increasing the fees, which are already disproportionately located throughout the state. And whether that would mean some kind of agreement or process with MDTA and the State Housing Authority, State Highway Authority, excuse me. But just getting more into that, because obviously, as we mentioned, there are no tolls on 495 or 270. Thank you.
Okay.
Certainly.
Thank you both. Appreciate it. All right. Well, this has been a meaty conversation for just two topics. And I appreciate the engagement from everyone. I do want to make the point again that things that we talked about today are potential pieces to the puzzle. But these ideas alone are not going to solve the fiscal hole that the Secretary has spoken so eloquently about in the coming fiscal year. The Commission won't be able to solve the problems of this year's CTP. And I think that, I know that the department is anxious to also share with us and the public what they're going to do in terms of balancing the current CTP. So that I would expect will be a forthcoming conversation. So in closing to the group, I just want to, at our next meeting, we're going to discuss interim recommendations the commission should make. I'll be circulating a list of recommendations soon that I would like to offer as chair for discussion. I think they fall along the 3 lines that we've had discussions about in terms of a prioritization process recommendations. Something like if we think MDOT should re-examine the prioritization process, if so, what does that look like? Timing and implementation, requirements of the process, things related to public feedback. The second item that's on the top of my head is really discussions about recommendations around, an EV program and tolling, and recommendations of things that we should look for in the next interim in 2024. If you plan to offer anything additional to these topics, I would respectfully ask that that you contact Jacqueline and Michelle and provide those in advance. And of course, the Train Commission email address as well is available and should be used to the extent possible. But again, thank you all for a very robust conversation, and I look forward to sharing more information with the commission and getting feedback from all of you as well. So thank you.